Professor Ridd, thank you so much for joining us. So my first question has to do with this. One of the many supposed dangers that we've been warned about regarding anthropogenic climate change is the deadly threat it poses to coral reefs. And we've been warned about this fact for decades. However, at least from my understanding, in the year 2022, the Great Barrier Reef had its largest coral cover on record. And so I guess my first question is, why do you think more people are not aware of that fact?
You're right. The Great Barrier Reef has got record amounts of coral. The Australian Institute of Marine Science has been monitoring this since 1985, and we've actually got twice as much coral this year as we did, say, in 2011. This is wonderful news. Now, why have people not heard about it? Well, I guess that good news doesn't sell, and a lot of the scientific institutions are not particularly trustworthy, so they're not actually pushing that good news.
So could you describe to an audience that maybe doesn't know anything about it, what are the major contributing factors that actually hurt coral formation?
The most important thing that kills coral actually is hurricanes. By far, they utterly destroy them. The huge waves from a hurricane obliterates the seabed and anything living on it, and coral reefs go with it.
Could you explain what coral bleaching means and whether it's dangerous to coral reefs?
Bleaching, corals are a little animal, a little pot-shaped animal, and inside the animal lives an algae which is able to get energy from the sun, so it photosynthesizes. Now, in bleaching, and that can occur when the water gets too hot or too cold or other stress, the coral actually chucks out that algae. And because the algae gives the coral its colour, the coral will go white, i.e. bleaches, if bleaching occurs.
So why exactly is it harmful to the reefs?
Well, it's a stress response actually, and some of the corals will actually die when they're bleached. Most of them won't actually, most of them will be quite okay. But the coral actually loses its ability to get energy from the sun during that period when it's bleached. But what happens is that the coral can actually take back those algae after the stress has gone away. And the really clever thing about corals is that they can take a different species of algae, which makes them more or less susceptible to hot water, or maybe better adapted to hot water. So it's actually a mechanism by which they can adapt to changing water temperatures.
Does bleaching actually wind up killing the coral itself?
Bleaching doesn't usually kill the coral. I mean, most of the time the coral gets a bit knocked around, it might grow a little bit slower for a few months, but it's fine. And this is one of the things that doesn't come across in most of the media. Bleaching is not necessarily death. So for example, in the big bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef in 2016, I estimate about 8% of the coral died. So it'd be like a forest where 8% of the trees died, right? But because corals can regrow incredibly fast, you know, you can double the amount of coral in 10 years, an 8% loss is not particularly important.
So it seems like the UN consensus is that coral bleaching's major cause is rising ocean temperatures due to climate change. But I guess my question to that would be, why is warmer water bad for corals when they seem to thrive in warm water?
Well, warm water actually isn't a problem for coral. Corals actually grow maybe 25% faster for every 1 degree increase in water temperature. So it really is surprising that they're saying that corals are going to be damaged. So for example, on the Great Barrier Reef, all the corals, or most of the corals, also live to the north on the equator, where the corals are maybe 2 or 3 degrees hotter, and the corals grow faster there.
So does that actually mean that having more warmer waters actually create new areas that become suitable for corals that previously weren't?
Precisely. So what we are actually seeing with the modest increase in temperature, in Australia the corals are growing a little bit further south, and in the northern hemisphere they're actually growing a little bit further north. What is new is our ability to monitor them. So we can now monitor water temperatures. We've got lots of scientists, you know, tens of thousands of scientists who are looking at this. So what's new is that we can now see what's going on, but of course they were occurring. The first instance of bleaching was recorded in the 1880s by one of the first marine biologists.
So Professor Ridd, your report, it said that there were 4 supposedly catastrophic bleaching events in the 6 years prior to the year 2022. Let me ask you, how have those events impacted coral reef formation all across the Earth?
Well, the authorities say that there was 4 supposedly catastrophic bleaching events, but actually they weren't. So, for example, on the Great Barrier Reef, we ended up with record high coral cover. So we had these 4 bleaching events in the last 6 or 7 years, and we've ended up with record high coral cover. So they couldn't have been that catastrophic. And you see in data right around the world that when there's been bleaching, there's this incredible bounce back. So they're not actually a big deal.
According to your research, are these types of events happening at a higher frequency now than before? And if so, why?
No, I don't think they are. Maybe just a very slight increase in frequency because we're getting a little bit warmer. But basically, if you have a really hot year, corals bleach. It's like, in the country around here, if you have a really dry year, all the trees lose their leaves to try to conserve water. So bleaching is one of these things that occurs under, a bad year.
So what if, let's say, a coral reef experiences one of these bleaching events? What is the average recovery period look like? Like, what's the time frame for the coral reef to recover?
Corals will, or a reef will pretty well recover within about 10 years, 5 to 10 years. And that could be from bleaching or a cyclone, we call hurricane cyclones, or even these starfish plagues that goes through. It's about half a decade to a decade.
And then just as a general question, how fast does coral grow in and of itself?
Well, the staghorn corals can grow remarkable amounts in a year. The great big block corals will only grow by about 1 centimetre. They're very slow growing. And by the way, they're not affected by bleaching or cyclones. They're like they're in for the long haul. They'll live for centuries, whereas the delicate corals will only have a lifetime of a couple of decades.
All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment. Listen, it's obvious that the financial system is not looking too great. After being pumped up with trillions of virtually free government dollars for many, many years now, well, the stock bubble might actually burst in the near future. And in that process, unfortunately, it could take away the nest egg of anyone who happens to be exposed to it. And so consider taking this opportunity to diversify into something which is beyond the grasp of Washington, D.C. and Wall Street, physical gold and silver. And the best company to use, in my opinion, is the sponsor of today's episode, American Hartford Gold, who, I should mention, is also my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. And besides myself, they have thousands of 5-star reviews from other Americans, and they also have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. And working with them is rather simple. They have a huge selection of coins, bars, and rounds to choose from. They have super friendly staff who you can call, and they can set up either gold delivery directly to your doorstep, or they can even set you up in a gold IRA. And then lastly, best of all, if you tell them the Roman sent you, they will throw in a free gold coin with your first qualifying purchase. So give them a call. The number is 866-242-2352. That's 866-242-2352. Or you can simply text Roman to 65532. I'll also throw a link to their webpage. It'll be down there in the description box below.
Professor Ridd, there's something that's been sort of gnawing at me ever since I started doing this research, which is that coral are living creatures just like anything else, and they have a lifespan just like any creature that you find on the land or in the sea. And so I just wonder, when you see these reports coming out of the UN and other global bodies, how can scientists differentiate a particular coral reef's decline and say it's not attributed to just the natural death of the coral themselves?
Look, this is a very good point. It's like corals are not allowed to die of anything. If they die of anything, then somehow it's humans that cause that. But you're right, every organism lives and it dies, and these big events where they die are entirely natural.
And when they're looking at it, can scientists actually differentiate the cause of death for a given coral?
Certainly differentiate between whether a coral got wiped out by a cyclone or a hurricane, as opposed to bleaching. So that's not difficult to do.
Professor Ridd, maybe for the audience members for whom this is the first foray into the coral world, let me ask you this. For scientists or teams of scientists who are going in and trying to assess the health of a coral reef, what specifically are they looking for? Like, what markers are they looking for to determine the health?
The most important thing is how much coral is on that reef. So you have a reef which might be a couple of miles wide and a mile across, and there's a whole lot of coral, but there's also a lot of other organisms, or there might be dead coral. So what you're really looking for is how much good live coral is on that reef. And a typical number would be about 30%. 30% is actually a good number, because there's algae, there's macroalgae, there's crustose, coralline, there's lots of different animals and organisms that live on the reef.
And I want to ask you a bit about how difficult it is to sort of figure this data out, because I know you published a report that was titled Coral in a Warming World, Causes for Optimism. And it said in the executive summary of your report that other parts of the world, in terms of data, is a lot less reliable than the Great Barrier Reef. So that's your report. And then the UN, they put out a separate report in the year 2021 titled Status of Coral Reefs of the World 2020. And that UN report, it's heralded as essentially the definitive work on coral reef climate-related science. And even that UN report, that's again heralded as like the #1 report in the world, it also tacitly acknowledges data reporting problems. Here's specifically what it said in the UN report, quote, "Only live hard coral cover and algal cover were measured in a sufficiently consistent manner by different monitoring programs around the world to support a quantitative global analysis." And so even their report, which is like, you know, the definitive work, says exactly what your report says, that the data collection is a big problem to overcome. And so can you sort of speak about the main problems surrounding data collection when it comes to coral reefs?
In Australia, we've been monitoring, because we've got the biggest reef in the world, the Great Barrier Reef. And we've been monitoring that since 1985 using exactly the same methodology. But for most of the other countries around the world, especially in the developing countries, there's been very little monitoring that's happened up until about, before about the year 2000. So their data before the year 2000 is completely hopeless. Since then, there's problems that they don't use necessarily the same methodology every year. They're not selecting sites randomly. So there are huge problems with the way this data is collected, and this really needs to be improved.
And what specifically makes it just so hard to monitor on a consistent basis?
The biggest problem, consistency, there's no excuse, that should just be consistent, but it is hard to monitor underwater because you need to be on scuba to do it properly. You can't monitor properly from airplanes or satellites, so it makes it extremely expensive, and you're often in very, very remote places. I often say that we know about as much as the bottom of the ocean on the Great Barrier Reef as we know about the surface of the moon. The main problem with unreliability is the inconsistent methodologies. Now, they are working on that, but we've really only got good data going back to 2000 for most of the world. And by the way, that doesn't show any major reduction in coral. We've come down a little bit in the last 5 years, but then we went up from about the year 2005 to about 2011 or something like that. So there are fluctuations, but there's nothing there in the world coral cover to be particularly worried about.
So getting back to the UN report, the one that was published in 2021, one of the main takeaways from the report that was then echoed out by the world's mainstream news outlets was that the UN said that 14% of coral reefs were lost between the years 2009 and 2018. Is that calculation by the UN accurate? And what do you attribute that loss to, if it is?
Well, it is strictly accurate, but what they forgot to say that there was an increase before 2009, and that really what we're seeing is just a little bit of variability. If you look at the uncertainty margins, we've actually got the same amount of coral around the world today as we had when proper records began roughly in the year 2000. And for the Great Barrier Reef, we've got about record amounts of coral compared with what we had over the last 35 years.
And just almost as an aside, there was a Netflix special that was very popular, and in it there was a scene where you had a climate scientist. He boarded a small airplane, and he sort of just flew over the Barrier Reef, and he visually documented coral bleaching. And so when I was watching that, I was like, is that really the way it happens? And so that's what I wanted to ask you. Is that like the preferred industry method of gauging bleaching events, just sort of flying over top and visually inspecting the coral reef? Is that sort of the best approach?
Unfortunately, it is, and it's complete rubbish because you can only see the surface corals that might be, 2 to 3, maybe 5 meters in depth. Those are the ones that are much more likely to bleach, but coral goes down to 50 or 100 meters, and that deep water coral is far less susceptible to bleaching. So you're not looking at all the reef, and really they've got to do better than that.
So maybe besides just a low-flying airplane looking for bleaching events, what are some of the other more prevalent reef observation methods that are used to calculate the health of a given coral reef?
Well, the best one is where they actually do transects and they put a diver down and they actually look at the reef. But reefs are huge, so you can imagine this is a very expensive thing to do. The Australian Institute of Marine Science tows divers around the reef, and they tow a diver around about 1,000 or a few thousand kilometres every year. It's very expensive.
And then in terms of like the area cover, how much of a given reef is actually monitored by scientists or teams of scientists before they turn around and come up with an actual assessment for the health of a given reef? Like what percentage, let's say, of a given reef is actually monitored?
Very good question. It's a tiny, tiny amount. Even with these transects, even with the good ones which we do in Australia, it's probably 0.01% of the reef that's actually monitored.
And then in terms of depth, let me ask you this. So when I think most people think of the Great Barrier Reef, they think of kind of snorkeling in shallow water. But does coral actually live in deeper waters as well? And if they do, how much of deep water coral is actually monitored for their health? And if so, do you actually need to like scuba dive down there and like visually observe them?
In the deep water, below 10, 20, well, below 20 metres, almost zero and almost never. So there's a great black hole out there, even in the best monitored reefs, where we really don't know what's going on. But they are far less susceptible to hurricanes and far less susceptible to bleaching. We know that for sure. It certainly lives in very deep water, down to 100 metres, even more actually. That's almost totally unknown, that coral. So it's very hard to monitor in the deep waters. With scuba, the deeper down you go, the less time you can spend down there. So there's a huge black hole as to in our knowledge of that deep water coral. But we do know that it's far less susceptible to bleaching and also far less susceptible to hurricanes/cyclones.
There was something that caught my eye going back to those two reports, your report and the report from the UN. And they both said that data is only reliable since the year 2000. Before the year 2000, data is not reliable. And you mentioned it earlier on during this interview as well. Why exactly is that? Why is data before the year 2000 just not reliable?
Essentially, there really wasn't much monitoring done before about the year 2000 anywhere except in Australia. So the data before 2000 is useless, but the data after 2000, well, you can argue with it, but what it certainly doesn't say is that there's been any significant loss of coral around the world. Maybe in particular areas there are, but if you aggregate the whole world, we've got about the same amount of coral now as we did 20 years ago.
And then also something in terms of skewing the data to fit a certain narrative. You mentioned in your report that there's a real need to improve the randomization of data sets, and so that's what you wrote in your report. And then in the UN report, there's something that was quite interesting to notice, which is the fact that there seemed to be a significantly large section of monitoring sites over in the East Asia seas. And I wonder, because East Asia, when you think of those sort of developing nations in that area, there's a lot of pollution there. In fact, most of the pollution in the world comes from a few sites in Africa and in East Asia. And so I wonder whether the UN chose those particular monitoring sites because that's the narrative they wanted to push, and perhaps those coral reefs are being damaged by pollution rather than overall climate change. So I guess my question is, do you think that particular region, East Asia, was chosen to be so heavily monitored in order to sort of suit a particular narrative?
There's certainly problems with their sampling methods. They don't randomise it. Interestingly, the coral reefs from the areas, developing nations, are not declining particularly either. They're actually doing all right, even in the developing areas. But there is often selective, focusing on the areas that are doing badly and ignoring the areas that are doing well.
And then in general, even outside of this UN report, how is it decided which particular coral reefs are selected for monitoring and data collection in terms of like location around the world? It seems like there's a lot of wiggle room in order to cherry pick the right areas to get the desired narrative you're looking for.
There is certainly room for cherry picking, and I think sometimes that does occur. Essentially, the selection is usually based on areas that you can get to easily, shallow, So we actually don't have a brilliant idea of the condition of a lot of reefs, most reefs in fact.
Well, let me ask you this: in your 27 plus year career, have you seen any kind of tricks played by coral reef climate scientists in order to pick certain data sets in order to skew the narrative in a certain direction?
Well, one of the worst ones was there was this island on the coast of Queensland here on the Great Barrier Reef, and they said that there was no coral on it. They showed some pictures which had no coral. The coral had been killed from whatever reason, and they said that this was representative of all the coral reefs along the inshore of the Queensland coast, about 1,500 miles worth. We went down there and took photographs ourselves, and we found spectacular coral. So this was appalling cherry picking and extrapolation, which really was just a shocking example of untrustworthiness of the institutions.
So getting back to that 2021 UN report, one of the things it said was that global average cover of hard coral was at over 30%. And so I just wanted to sort of ask clarification. Does that mean that there is active living coral on over 30% of the coral reef? Is that what that number means?
30% coral cover does mean that you've got 30% of the seabed covered by coral. And people think, well, that sounds bad, but it's not, because a coral reef will have patches of sand, patches of crustose coralline algae and various other organisms. And so 30% is a pretty good number actually as an average. It's like, your grass on your lawn. You'll have grass, and you'll have a few weeds, and you'll have a bit of clover and a few bare patches. Coral reefs are the same, and 30% coral is about what you should, rough average.
And generally, how can scientists tell whether it's living or not?
Oh, if it's not living, it gets covered by slime and algae within a couple of weeks. It's very easy to tell whether a coral has died.
And why is the use of percentage changes in coral formations misleading? Or is it misleading? Is it misleading to use the percent change in coral formations as sort of a data point when presenting your findings?
Well, it's not really a misleading number. The problem with it is that if you say that the coral reef has gone from 35% coral cover down to 25% coral cover, that's a 10% change. This is awfully sort of technical. But it's actually about a 40% change as well. So it depends on whether you look at the difference or the relative ratio. So it's complicated. That might not be the best question to ask.
Well, let me ask you this, Professor. In light of everything you've said, why do you have organizations, international organizations like the International Coral Reef Initiative, the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, as well as the Australian Institute of Marine Science, why are they all pushing this climate change hysteria in relation to coral reefs?
I think a lot of them really believe that the reefs are damaged. Remember, they're marine biologists. They often get very emotional when they see coral dying, and coral must die naturally. But there is also a degree of self-interest to keep the funding flowing. So there's all sorts of perverse things going on. And they also, I think they're in a form of groupthink. They've got themselves all worked up together. They've excluded dissenters, and this is what happens.
Do they stand to gain something, professionally or otherwise?
Well, essentially, their jobs. If you go back on this coast here, if you go back 50 years, there was probably 5 marine scientists working on the coast. Now there's probably closer to, 2,000 or 3,000. And if you then multiply that up, a lot of people now rely on the Great Barrier Reef being doomed for their livelihood.
And then, in terms of trust in the science, I know we've seen in recent years through the whole COVID fiasco, and more recently in our efforts to sort of confront climate change science misinformation, that the integrity of the scientific community in general has wildly been compromised. And the predictable result is that people around the world simply sort of tune out and write them off as just essentially being hacks. And so given these revelations that anthropogenic climate change is not this deadly threat to coral reefs as we've been sold, is there any reason for people to continue to listen to climate scientists?
Well, we shouldn't. Not until that they pull together their quality assurance systems. They've been proven to be untrustworthy, especially with regard to the Great Barrier Reef, where we've now never had more coral. So until they get their quality assurance systems up and running properly, we should no longer trust them. So one of the things that I'm trying to do now is force the scientific institutions to lift their game, because we really need reliable scientific institutions. It's one of the fundamental bedrocks of our society.
And then maybe to shift gears a little bit outside of everything we've been discussing in terms of the climate, are there any serious problems that are facing coral reefs that do deserve the public's attention?
There are lots of problems. There's overfishing, there's pollution going out on some of the reefs, especially in developing countries. So it's not like there's a shortage of worries with regard to coral reefs. It's just that climate change, if anything, will actually improve the situation, because corals actually like warmer water.
So Professor Ridd, lastly, I just wanted to focus a bit on you as a person who's actually trying to bring some common sense and sensibility to this particular topic and sort of the ramifications of doing that. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what happened to you over at James Cook University?
Yes, I've been working on the Great Barrier Reef since 1984 for James Cook University for a very long time on the Great Barrier Reef. And essentially I was seeing again and again that there was very poor quality assurance. That stuff was coming out which was just wrong. And I essentially said that the work coming out of some of these scientific institutions was untrustworthy because they didn't have proper quality assurance systems. Now, that wasn't saying everything they were doing was wrong. It's just that you couldn't tell because they didn't have the systems in place. And that made me very unpopular, and the university ended up firing me because of that.
And so what actually happened leading up to their attempts to censure you and then terminate you after 27 years of work?
Well, it was this saying that there was quality assurance problems. I also, that point that I made previously about this island that had coral, that they said had no coral, I blew the whistle on that, which made me incredibly unpopular. So I was bucking the narrative. I was actually damaging the funding prospects of the university, and people just didn't like the message, and I just had to be got rid of, basically.
How did the appeal hearings play themselves out?
We had a court case which went right to the High Court of Australia, which is equivalent to the Supreme Court in America. And interestingly, the High Court said that the university was wrong to censure me and to tell me to stop talking about it. So I had this academic freedom of speech, which the university took away. So the university lost on that. But perversely, they said that because of my work contract, that the university had the right to tell me to be silent about their effectively unlawful behaviour. So it was one of these funny legal things. We won on the main point, but I ended up still losing my job anyway.
And I guess my last question is, what are you doing now? And if someone is interested in following your work, where can they find you?
Well, nowadays I work for the Institute of Public Affairs, which is basically a think tank. I work for no pay, so that people can't accuse me of being in the pay of the coal industry or whatever. And essentially I'm working on corals, but also coral reefs, but also on quality assurance systems in science. So I'm interested in the COVID thing and the climate change things, how the systems have got us to this stage that we can now no longer trust the institutions.
All right, Professor Ridd, thank you so much.